Welcome to the Quality of Mind podcast, where you can explore the pioneering and game-changing understanding that unlocks the secret source to more productivity, peace, and potential. If you're fed up with the conventional echo chamber to personal development and human potential, and if you want to be part of the new breeders of leaders and entrepreneurs, come and explore the 4 psychology approach, enabling sustainable, wide-ranging transformation in every aspect of life and work, for exponential, not just marginal gains. Get ready to listen fresh and discover your secret source. Welcome to the Quality of Mind Transforming Business podcast series. So today's episode, another conversation lined up, and this time I have a new guest to the show who I'm really excited to be talking about because I think he's got a great career that came into the world of before psychology and coaching, and how he now positions himself in the industry is really interesting. So I want to welcome to the show Andrew Sewell. Andrew, could you just give us a minute or two on your background and how come we're talking? And then we'll dive in from there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Piers, and thanks for having me on. I'm Andrew. I'm a leadership coach and a personal coach. And I've written a book called The Overthinker's Guide to Life. Most of my career pre-coaching was spent first in script writing and then in advertising as an advertising creative. I'm a copywriter by trade. I became a creative leader in my mid-40s. I would say I had a combination of a stress, burnout, change of heart. Went through that career change transition. I'd always been interested in psychology and self-help and, Buddhism, spirituality, meditation, toyed with the idea of becoming a psychotherapist, and then gradually became obvious that coaching was going to be the perfect route for me. Coaching that also didn't tie me to one particular model, but sort of gave me the breadth to bring in lots of the things that I'd sort of learned over the years. Yeah, so that's a very brief summary.
Yeah.
Curiosity is the word that carries through everything I've done.
One of my favorite words. It's at the end of, I think, every email I send. Have fun being curious. So I'm with you on that. And what's great, Andrew, you and I we realized we spoke about 2019. We had a phone call. I thought it was last year, but apparently you told me it was like 4 years ago. And I've been watching you from afar, and obviously one of the advantages you've got is your background in communications and copywriting means that you write some great stuff on LinkedIn, and you've got a lovely way of engaging people at where they're at. I think on your LinkedIn profile it says a leadership coach for professional overthinkers, and you've got Overthinkers Anonymous, and your book title is it Overthinker's Guide to Life or something like that? Have I got that right? Yeah,
that's right. The Overthinker's Guide to Life. Yeah.
So, and I often say to my clients, the biggest addiction of the modern times isn't sort of smoking or ultra high processed foods or TikTok. It's thinking, but it's the one we don't really know about. And some people would go, "What do you mean overthinking?" So that's your hook, isn't it? But I'd love to hear, just to start with, before we get more into what you then point people to after that. But how did you land on that as your kind of customer hero hook?
Because I'm an overthinker primarily. So in my job as an advertising creative, it was my job to come up with concepts, right? Which is like the word concept might feature in this conversation.
Yeah.
So every day I'd be, trying to think of ideas, but at the same time, I've got a lot of psychological baggage going on. I'd be comparing myself to other creatives in the office. I'd be judging what will the client like. I'd be figuring out the politics of this relationship with this person. My mind would be super busy, sometimes with creative thoughts, sometimes with stressful thoughts. And then at night, I'd just be, up till 2:00 in the morning with crazy racing thoughts. Combination of I must solve this problem, this creative problem, mixed in with the odd idea. And then sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and scribble down an idea. And then it would sometimes it might be good, but sometimes it wouldn't be so good. And then I just sort of extrapolated that basic premise of me being the example, and then lots of my coaching clients, their presenting problem was, my mind is so busy, I have racing thoughts, I've got so much to do. And I was like, okay, this is a common problem. And it's kind of a decent way in for me to talk about overthinking from multiple angles, both the psychological and the before psychology, as you talk about, which I'd come from sort of from the meditation side of things. Just seemed to be like probably the biggest word I could use that created a kind of niche. You know what I mean? But
No,
yeah, I totally agree with the thinking addiction. Yeah.
yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? It's funny because sometimes people first hear this, they like to defend their thinking smarts, which is again done by more thinking. But because they kind of think, well, the reason I've got to where I've got to in life is because I think. And some people might even go, well, my thinking's better than person A, B, C, D. That's why I'm so successful or smart or whatever. So we start off by, no, I need to think. Now, what we're saying here, just to be very clear, listeners, we're not saying all thinking is bad. No, 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 no. We're saying that we use thought in the wrong way. So thinking is a utilitarian faculty of the human mind. It's how you come up with a beautiful creative idea. It's how you know how to do things like wire a plug. You'll have a thought going, oh yes, it's the brown fuse, not the whatever one. So it's not that it doesn't have value. It's just we use the tool for the wrong job. So we use it to tell us how happy we are, how good we are, what the future is going to be, what happened to the past, what we think of that person versus ourselves. So that's the problem, isn't it? So most of the problem with thinking is that we just use it in the wrong way and we get too much of it. Would that fit with your way you talk about it and understanding?
Yeah. 100%. So it's the thinking is an incredibly powerful tool. It's why humans have been able to evolve to where we are now, combined with the word imagination, which is another incredibly powerful concept, allows you to imagine where a tiger might be, so you don't go to that end of the woods. It allows you to imagine where dangers might be, and therefore not go there, and therefore survive. Back in the days of try. Problem is, right now the world is way safer. But yet, in our imagination, keeps imagining all these scary things that we use ourselves to freak ourselves out. So that's a kind of thinking that's mostly thinking that causes you stress and suffering. Yeah, they're using a screwdriver to try and hammer a nail into the wall.
Mm.
Like, that's what people don't get. People just think, oh my God, this thinking is like always on in my mind. It is me. It's what's got me here. There needs to be just some discernment between what's quality thought, to tie into your quality of mind podcast title, what's fresh thinking, what's like useful and what's the 95% of habitual thinking that usually is just making you feel stressed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting, isn't it, that when you start to notice thought, you actually suddenly realize, gosh, I have quite a lot of it. And there's that, I don't know, statistic came from, we have 70,000 thoughts a day or something like that. And it doesn't matter. It's a big number, right? Now, even when people start to explore that, coming in via the psychology of going, oh, there is thought. I actually think, and this is where I think you've got to now as well in what you point to, which is why I guess we're talking, is that sometimes then puts the burden or emphasis on what we would call us to be discerning about that thinking, going, oh my gosh, I've just noticed I have lots of thoughts. I have good ones, medium ones, brilliant ones, rubbish ones, self-sabotaging ones, low mood ones. And then we start to have thinking about our thinking, which of course adds more thinking. And the biggest thought we miss, or we just think isn't even a thought, is this one about Andrew or Piers, right? This Piers thought, this Andrew thought, this me thought, we don't think that's a thought. We think that's something way more fundamental. So I don't want to push you in that direction, but my guess is you probably don't mind going there. Does that fit when I say actually the thinking can make us have more thinking because we start to notice it more and then try to fix it, and then we all get sucked into the problem of the me thought?
Yeah. So you can't solve thinking with more thinking, like 100%, because I mean, that is the definition of overthinking, right? So that's why I veer away from things like positive thinking and self-help, because even if you're trying to conjure up some super powerful, confident thoughts, what you're really doing is making your mind busier, and that's making you feel worse, to put it simply, feel more stressed. So, but that's obviously a common strategy in the world, right? Okay, so if I can just turn my horrible thinking, stressful thinking into super confident thinking, then, problem solved. I mean, even if you think you've done that for a little bit, it really doesn't work, because, I mean, what even is a thought, right? It's some nebulous changing thing it's not an object, it's static, random, it's just keeps flowing through your mind. So to try and pin it down and change it's a bad idea, essentially. It's a concept that's been used to try and explain something that wasn't even a concept in the first place. I'm a bit nebulous. The idea of the Andrew character, the mini-me, as I refer to it in my Overthinker's book, which usually combines a lot of what you would call the inner critic or the inner judge, or thoughts about the future, thoughts about lack, ruminations about the past. I wish I didn't speak to my manager like that. Why did I say this to my partner? Or in the future, tomorrow's presentation is going to be a nightmare. So these are all the kind of self-referential thoughts that we don't think of as self-referential thoughts. We just think, oh, that's Andrew thinking. And one of the reasons we buy that story, one, we've been conditioned into that identity from, zero onwards, all through school, all through caregivers, into the world of work. Myself is on the line here. I've got to prove myself at every stage. So the idea of the self becomes solid. And then we try and secure that thing that never was secure in the first place. The idea of feelings ties into that. So the thinking, when you think something, it comes with a feeling usually, and the feeling's one of contraction or anxiety or just some kind of feeling. That reinforces the sense that this must be a self inside of us that's to fix something somehow. So the way out of that, or even to start like looking at this, again, to go back to the curiosity word, is just to not presume that you know everything. I think part of the problem is like people just think they are the finished article, right? I know how the world works now, and I know how to operate in it, and I know, who the bad guys are and the good guys are, and that's a done deal. Once you've made that conclusion, you've just fully bought your conceptual thinking, and in a way, you've screwed yourself over. You've kind of killed the world in a way, because once you conceptualize something, it loses its light, and it becomes like an abstract map of the world rather than a live thing. And all of the creativity, all of the joy, all of the happiness and the freedom is in the aliveness, right? And that's kind of always there, but it's covered over by the David Bohm, he said smog of neurobiology or something, which is like a brilliant way to describe thinking.
So lots and lots of interesting things in what you just said there, Andrew. And let's just pick on a few. One thing you said about is getting that we think we're the finished article, so we don't really often challenge our thinking. We think, oh yeah, well, I kind of know what the world looks like. I know what that person's like. Occasionally we get a fresh thought, and we can see that, but we spend too long kind of buying into our own thinking, not seeing how fundamentally unreliable thinking is, right? It is just our best guess in that moment. But the thing I really want to get into, which might be a little bit fresher for people, or even a little bit more thought-provoking in the right way, particularly if you're a new listener, you said a phrase, you said, oh, self-referential thinking, right? So most of us will be able to identify with the idea that we have thinking, about the world, about, that's a nice tree, that's a nice tomato. And then we have thinking about me, am I good enough, my past, my future. And that often is less helpful because it's comparative and it's doing all that. But the bit that I find really fascinating about that is almost going a question before that, which is, well, who's asking that? Or where is that? Or what is that thing that's having the thinking about a self-referential self? Now, does that make, as I say that to you, what does that conjure up in that direction of questioning?
It conjures up laughter. It conjures. I mean, it's like, it's a good question. It's like, what even could that be? That is this. The only thing I could say now is another thought, right?
Yeah.
Which is some attempt by my thought process to give an answer to an unanswerable question. But to be able to notice the fact that there's not really an answer to that question, or there's just a thought created like mistake, if you know what I mean. It's like some imaginary answer. Like that's the whole ball game, really. It's just we keep buying into that.
Yeah.
Keep thinking.
And I think for me, as you probably know, it's 24, 25 years in this coaching malarkey, and it's taken me till about 15, 20 years ago to spot the issue with what I was doing and trying to rectify that now. That one of the most invisible, innocent mistakes the system makes, or what we make, is our case of mistaken identity. All this thought stuff that we've just been talking about is coming from me being a separate entity, a separate body mind that's capable of having thought. So there's little me here, there's Andrew over there, and there's another 7 billion of us all around the planet. And we're all just their little thinking machines, separate entities that are thinking machines. And why do we think that? Well, in short, because it appears like that. It appears that I'm separate and I end at the end of my fingers. I have thoughts, that I'm my body mind, that the trees are out there and my thoughts are in here. So there's an external world and an internal world. And it appears like that. And I've been told that from when I was 1 year old. Now, what we don't do is challenge that with fresh curiosity from direct experience. Now, regular listeners will know that that's all my work now is about, that the force psychology, shifting us to undo that case of mistaken identity. So the idea of self-referential thinking is a bit of an oxymoron because there's no self for the self to have thinking about, no separate self. There is an appearing me, right? So I can look in the mirror and have all sorts of thoughts, but it's all the same. The thoughts and the me are coming from the same place. So if I put that into really common language, let's say we have a thought about, I'm going to have some broccoli for dinner. We would call that a thought. Broccoli for dinner. Or maybe I'll have some sweet potato. So we go, there's two thoughts. And if you said, well, could that broccoli thought have a thought itself? Right? Can the thought about having broccoli for dinner have its own thought? People would go, no. A thought can't have its own thought. You've got two thoughts there. You've got the sweet potato thought and the broccoli thought. The broccoli thought didn't have the sweet potato thought. They might have been quite close together in what we would call time. And people would go, well, you're mad thinking a thought can have a thought. But what we don't realize is that when we say, Piers had a thought about broccoli, well, Piers is a thought too. So there we're saying a thought can have a thought because Piers is just a thought. It's a very consistent thought I've had for probably 49 years. And it's some perceptions as well. But it is itself a thought. So, of course, Piers doesn't have thoughts. But it looks like it does, that I've suddenly decided this thing, which is a bunch of thoughts and perceptions itself, is capable of having thoughts. Now, apart from me having weird references to broccoli and sweet potato, where are you on that, Andrew?
I like the idea that I like the invitation for people to say a thought can't have a thought, because it's super obvious that a thought can't have a thought. It's like, that's just a weird concept. So it's an invitation to dive deeper into what we think of it as this self thought, this self concept. And for me, it's kind of useful to look at the idea of concepts in the sense that, as you've talked about before, I think, so when we're born as babies, we're born in a world of feeling and sensation, no concepts going on until another human starts to point at tables and say, that's a table. Or if it's in German, it's not that word, it's a German word for table. So we start to learn these concepts around the age of 2 or 3. We learn the idea, somebody points in the mirror and says, that's Piers, that's Andrew. And then we have a self concept, the beginning of a self concept, which then we add lots of beliefs and labels to. I'm a boy, I'm good at maths at school, I like riding my bike, and all these beliefs and thoughts get attached to this concept. So that's why it starts to feel heavy as a thought, like a super thought, because there's lots of thoughts attached. If you zoom into the actual present moment or the now and start to get curious about what's actually going on in your mind, the first thing you'll probably realize is, well, lots of people realize, oh my God, my mind is super busy, I'm having lots of thoughts, right? That's what sometimes freaks people out. But then you'll see that you can't really control what thoughts going to appear next. So that's a big deal, right? It's like, well, how can I control this self, Andrew, if I can't even control the thought that's going to appear next? So that's like that can be an insightful idea. And then if you kind of get even more curious about this, you can see that conceptual world that you've created is a kind of like overlay on top of what was the thing that was there before somebody started teaching you the concepts. We, in various spiritual traditions, they would call words like awareness or consciousness, or I don't know, the word God could even come up there, or self with a capital S. So that's the game, really, to sort of explore what might be, you call it before the psychology. So the psychology of the concepts, and then what's before that. And that's like can seem like a nebulous question, because by definition, you cannot think your way to that place. You have to kind of use some other kind of method. So what would you say to that?
Well, I talk about the little game I used to play as a kid. Was I wanted to see whether the fridge light went off when you shut the door, and every time I open the door to check, the light comes on. So you can't examine your psychology from within your psychology. You can't use a thought to try and find out a thought. And we're pointing to this thing that's before. New listeners might be going, what do you mean before? Do you mean my soul? They might put another word in. Do you mean me before I think? Me in a quiet moment? Me when I meditate? And we don't mean any of those things. But what I point to in my work is what I call direct inquiry, which is the best, of all the unhelpful things we can do to try and help point to this before. It's the best one I've come up with so far. And that's to invite people to explore the very moment of being they're in, without any reference to what you've just described as concepts, without any reference to anything we've pre-learned, without any reference to anything learned. And I often nickname it as like, if an alien had just dropped into this body mind right now, didn't know anything, had no conditioning that I'd had or you'd had or anything, and just to notice what happens. It's a bit like what a 1-year-old is, really. And using the very lightest language, because you have to communicate it somehow, I guess. What would we know? What would we absolutely be able to say yes to? And all we'd be able to say yes to is, as in what's eternal, consistent, and always there, is there's a capacity for thought and feeling and perception, but let's just stick with the theme of thought. There's a capacity for it. The content of thought is constantly changing. That comes and goes all the time. So you can't say that's what I am, because it's constantly changing. If you have to go to what's fundamental from direct inquiry, you start to see, well, there's just the knowing of thought, or the capacity, or the awareing of thought. And something that comes into that awareness is the idea of me. So the fact I'm aware of peers means I can't fundamentally be peers, because there's something that's aware of peers. There's moments when I have no peers awareness. If I'm really in flow, there's no peers. In deep sleep, there's no peers, but there's always the capacity there. So you start to see that thoughts, it's part of the content, it's part of the Netflix, it's not part of the screen, it's part of the weather, not the sky. And if we go back before and try and see what's before, we can't use our thinking to get there, we can't use our psychology to get there, but we can get a slight sensing of it if we can do this direct inquiry thing, where we just go to direct experience in the moment. We can kind of go, oh yeah, we can kind of, I don't even know what the word is. We can sense it. We can know that there's something fundamental that we are before thinking, perceiving, feeling. But normally our mind's way too busy and fascinated by the content to see that. So we're so fascinated by the Netflix, we don't even notice it's on a screen.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're so fascinated by the weather, we don't even notice there's a sky. So we have to demerge, or the first step could be to demerge or unhook the content of our thinking from the capacity.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm looking out into my garden right now. And one way I could look into the garden is to there's an apple tree and there's some apples on it and there's a washing line and then there's our house in the background. And then in my sort of foreground, there's a bookcase and then there's the laptop. So I've just described loads of separate parts and then there's me. There's
Yeah.
7 separate parts in the thing I've just described, right? So each of those is obviously a concept that my mind has overlaid on that reality, the awareness, the screen that I'm seeing. So another way to just invite people to sort of get a sense of this is just look at that scene and don't do any of what I've just done. Just look at the whole scene. Just look at the gestalt of it. And then your mind will, if you're not used to doing this, your mind will just, your attention will go to different places. But just see what see what that is before the conceptualizing happens. And that's it's like this here now, right? That's the simplest way you could possibly say it. It's just like this thing that is appearing now is what we're talking about.
And yes, yeah. And I'll add a nuance to that, because often what we can start to see first is, oh yeah, there's an apple tree or a bookcase, and sometimes I add a descriptor on nice apple tree, not nice bookcase, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, but with that, we're saying yes. So you don't need the additional thinking. It's nice bookcase, big bookcase, bad apple tree, good apple tree, because that's thinking about the concept. And even the idea that it's an apple tree or a bookcase is a concept, because to a 1-year-old baby, what's an apple tree? They don't have an apple tree or a pear tree, or they don't even know what a tree is, right? Or what a bookcase is. So you can go further back to that, and without language or conceptualization, there isn't really something you could call a tree. But even if you go back before that, and then where's the awareness coming from? Because one of the most hidden pieces of thinking that we have isn't, is the apple tree good or bad? It isn't, that's an apple tree, not a pear tree. It's the source of thinking. Because most people believe and been brought up to think, my thoughts come from my imagination and my memory, or, something to do with me. But as we've just said earlier, that's impossible. Because me is a simultaneous thought to the apple tree. So how can the thought have come from you? There's no separate you. Can you find, here's a question I love, can you find the separate you that's having that thought?
Yeah, no. And you would never have it would be really weird if you had the thought, this is me looking at an apple tree. You just don't, think it doesn't work like that. You just see a thing, an apple tree, and the thought apple tree comes into your mind. So there's no self anywhere in that process.
Not if you're in direct experience of that moment.
Yeah,
Yes. So
yeah.
when we're in flow, I always say in flow, we lose it. We'd even say, I lost myself in that book, the great book, or I lost myself.
I
I
agree.
was playing sport. I lost myself. Because, people get interviewed. We're recording this during the Olympics, and people say, well, how did you manage to do that? How did you They kind of don't know, right? They don't go, oh, I thought this, and it just occurs. It just occurs. And in that moment of flow, there's no self. The self gets kind of added in.
Yeah. The self gets added in when somebody asks the question about this thing. And then
Yeah.
because everyone thinks they've got a self, they start having to create a story about how that happened. Oh, well, I did, I trained for 4 years and then I had the strategy and it sort of worked. But you're right. Most people in the post Olympics, if you watch the post, like right after the race in the
Yes.
swimming, I think
They're
that's
still in it.
like, I don't know. Like, that's amazing. Like, that's all I've got, basically.
Yeah. It's so marked that. And they have to then kind of get themselves back into duality. They're in the flow of it. And then some interviewers shove the mic under their nose and they have to go, okay, yeah, oh yeah, well, it's because I had so much nutritional training on this, or so they have to kind of try and reverse engineer some explanation of why they did their PB or
Yeah, yeah.
or something. And actually, in that moment, there was no self there,
No.
and they probably had very little thinking. They might have had some thinking emergently popping up. Like we said right at the beginning of the conversation, thinking is very, very powerful and useful, but it was never self-referential, and it never felt like it came from them.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, that's not yeah, it's not to say that in that swimming race, that swimmer was not having thoughts in their mind. I don't know, just sort the arm kick out, something that they've automatically learned. Okay, now like there'll be a sense of what they need to do in the race, but it'll be part of like the whole experience.
It will just appear
Yeah,
and then dissolve again. It'll appear when necessary. So let's say they're doing 10 laps, it will just appear. Oh, 8 to go. Right, bang, then it comes in,
yeah,
goes. And it's just super helpful in that moment, but none of the self-referential stuff. So the system is just beautifully clever when we are in what I would call a high quality of mind or an open aperture, just to provide literally the right amount of thinking that we need. Now, we don't spend much of our time in that. We spend most of our time, as your book points out, overthinking everything. So the more that, but I think the reason, if we were answering the question, how come nowadays, I say nowadays, it feels like we think a lot. Yeah. What has happened to us in the last 150 to 50 years that means now we think a lot? I think it coincides with what we were actually saying before we press record. It's to do with the deification of the self. This idea of me being a thing that needs to do well in the world, prove itself to the world, succeed, keep up with the neighbors, all that kind of stuff. That has meant that we self-identify so much more with what's going on, and the rise of the self has led to the rise of overthinking, as opposed to just having the perfect amount of thinking for where we're up to. Well, what's your view on the answer to that question then? How come?
in terms of the deification of the self, which I like that phrase. It's intriguing and it's also I think true to a certain extent. A documentary was called The Century of the Self, about like the 20th century, right? Plotted all the major events in the Second World War, the rise of commerce and spending culture and individualism and Thatcherism, and there's no such thing as society. Like all those little key clues that are coming out there, right? Suddenly, all of the importance is on the individual. And it's like it's tied with advertising and spending. It's tied with
Yeah.
originally psychotherapy and Freud, which is this is about you and your story and your unconscious, whatever that is. And then, so, it's not about so much about religion anymore, although that's still present, obviously. But there's just super focus on this thing we call the self. So obviously, if people have been saying the word self for 100 years, people are going to double down on the reality of this like thing that is not really a thing. The way that we shop, I used to work in advertising for my sins, and it's kind of, so you sell into the emotional lack. It's like you buy Volvo because you want security. I want a security for myself and my family. So this car's super safe, or
I want to be like look like I'm really rich, so I'll buy a Ferrari or a watch that's super expensive. Because you're worth it. That like tagline, the cosmetics brand. It's like
Yeah.
really until you buy that product, somehow I'm not worth it. It's like really sort of prevalent and obvious. The rise of social media, obviously, massively sort of reinforces that idea. Now I've not only got this self in the supposed like everyday world that I need to protect and make look good. Now I've got this alternative avatar and enhancement of myself on Instagram that has to be perfect. It's like it's. Can you see why there's a
Doubling
rising
down.
problems?
It's absolutely doubling down, isn't it? And I always find it, if you have a little look at the indigenous tribes, and what they point to, Aboriginal, Maori, or whatever it is, Papua New Guinea, they have a lot less self. That they would talk about Mother Nature in a different way to us. They would talk about being part of the system, not owning the land, and to see that we are being lived, that nature lives us, right? It's not little me that needs to fight the world. It's not little me that needs to be something separate, be a better version of a separate me in the world. It's because it'd be crazy, you know, a leaf on a tree doesn't care what the other leaves are doing. It doesn't have to work out what time it's going to fall off and decompose to become fungi or whatever. It's just part of the system. But we don't seem to think we are part of the system, or we think there's a system, but we have to sort of connect into it. I must connect with my spirituality. No, you're a spiritual being having a human experience, not the other way around, or not a human being having a spiritual experience, to quote what's his name, Tilda Chardin. And I think we've forgotten that we are just a individuated part of the system. We're not even separate. So I would distinguish between the words individuated and separate. So we are individuated part of the system, the greater system of nature, if you want to call it something, awareness, consciousness, not separate to it. But the self seems to think it is separate and it can change the system. So I must have better thinking. You can't have better thinking. You're part of the system. There's no free will, and we can not want to get into that in this episode, but I have on others. There's no free will to have better thinking, right? So of course, if you go to direct inquiry again, what we're saying, direct experience, you can't find a you to have its own thoughts separate of the system. But the problem we've had in the last 50, 100 years is we've been kind of conditioned that we should do or can, which causes all sorts of problems because you're kind of rowing into the wind because you can't do it. You can't have better thinking. So to tell someone they can is mean. I'm slightly anthropomorphizing this now by saying it's mean, but it's like telling someone to dry off while they're still in the shower.
That's a nice analogy.
You can't do it.
Yeah, yeah. Um, if you buy into the idea of the Big Bang, that was an explosion of energy that kind of, created the universe as we know it. So if that single point, there was a sudden, expansion of energy that has been going on for, millions of years, at what point did that energy become separate from itself? Like, so by definition, yeah, this is a scientific view. The energy slows down and then you get matter, or the energy for a bit less slow and you get liquid, or the energy is a gas, but it's all the same energy, right? So it's not theoretically possible that we could be separate from anything else because it's literally the same energy.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's just a logical way to point at something that is just really weird for most people to get to even explore. But it has to be true if you look at it like that. I don't see how you could argue with that point. I think you point around like the separate self must have arisen because it had an evolutionary advantage, right? Because like that's how it works, right? So maybe I would, and we're getting into the nebulous world of arguing about concepts now, which is always dangerous because don't hold these concepts lightly, basically. If humans believe they are separate selves, it's easier to create a society that functions because you can create a justice system where you can point at somebody and say they're criminal, right? You can have self-accountability, so you can you aren't pulling your weight in work, you're not doing your work in this tribe, so and so. So it's like I can see how it's a way to help groups function better, but yeah, on an individual level, it causes a lot of unnecessary stress.
Yeah, and I think it's no problem having an appearance of a separate self if we didn't think it was separate, right? So I think the idea we're individuated is lovely. I think it makes us a richer experience of the world. Uniqueness and individuality, they're all beautiful things. I wouldn't want to, so I love falling for this. I love thinking I am sometimes a separate self. I think it brings shades of joy and non-joy to everything. But the reason why I find that lovely now is because I know I know it isn't really separate. It's just appearing, right? So it's like you can really enjoy the roller coaster or the horror movie when it's a movie or roller coaster ride. You can have all those feelings, and I don't think we should be. So the individuatedness is wonderful because it makes the world a richer place, and there's probably evolutionary advantages as well, as you say. But it's knowing I'm still part of the system. The system's got me, right? I am the system. I individuate down. It appears separate, but fundamentally, I'm part of something way more essential and fundamental.
Yeah, it's a massive relief. It's
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Because it
liberating
takes the
insight.
onus off me to sort the world out, right? I am part of the system, right?
100%, yeah.
Now let's try and put some bows on this, Andrew, because we've been having a beautiful conversation. So let's just try and, if we can, answer a couple of key questions succinctly, if I'm ever able to do that. So let's ask one question. So if you had to give a simple answer to how come we have so much overthinking, what would be your 20-second answer to that?
Because we believe we are a separate person that is somehow lacking or not good enough, and therefore has to prove themselves to be good enough. And that is a lie, as we've just discussed.
Yeah.
But it's a very pervasive lie. But that's what causes the overthinking.
Yeah, and thinking's the way to solve that.
Yeah, and
right?
thinking you can think your way through this thing.
Yeah, right.
Happier land.
Perfect, get you. So question 2, what are we saying and pointing in our direction of work is the antidote or the solution to this society that overthinks? How would we give a 20-second answer to that?
Question what you think are foregone conclusions. So
Mhm.
get you can only see this from your own experience. You can't read about it in a book, as I tried for many years.
Mhm.
Get curious about your own experience and see what's actually going on in your awareness and your how thoughts show up. And for me, over time, it's just dawned on me or become apparent as a sort of sense in a way that there is no separation. This is just this is a unique expression, right? What I'm saying now is like a unique expression of a unique programming or a unique perception, but it's not separate from a bigger whole. And that then the word relax comes to me. It's like, okay, I relax a bit now. I don't need to stress this. And then I can just sort of see what happens. Unfolding, life unfolds rather than trying to improve something or force something or control something. It's just, I mean, we didn't even talk about the whole idea of where these joyful feelings come from or where happiness really is, which is in that awareness rather than the thing that you can, a concept to be striven for.
Yeah.
But it's the most profound shift I've experienced.
Yeah.
And it's long to even see it because I was so much of an overthinker.
Well, and I think you share, many people I work with, and myself included to some extent, would absolutely echo that. And just to give my slight version of the answer to that question, I would totally agree with you. But the bit I'm going to just invite people also to do is when we're saying get curious about your awareness, I'm focused on the word your, right? What is it not just the content. Don't just get curious about the content of what's rocking up in your thoughts. I mean, that is helpful, right? But just go back a bit further to actually see, what is this me I think's having all the thinking, and can I really find it? And go get curious at that level. And I think the other thing I would recommend to people is there's lots of ways that we can tactically help us have less thinking, right? Go for a run, do some yoga, meditation, mindfulness, have a spa day, reduce your world down so there's less annoying people that give you annoying thoughts or whatever. There's lots of tactical ways to do it, etc., etc. But if you want a transformative shift around this, rather than just tactics, rather than something that's a crutch for your misunderstanding, then have a look more, I'm going to say the word profoundly or essentially, at what we're pointing to here, which is the stuff that's happening before the content. Because that is what you've recognized. As you say, you looked in information for a long time, you looked into your thoughts a long time, didn't quite get there. But it's when you realize what you truly were, being part of this system, the relax came in, the relief came in, and you're like, oh, I don't need to be this busy-minded so-and-so. And the reason I don't have to be this busy-minded little mini-me is because I'm part of something else. And the idea that I'm separate, the idea there's something that has to sort the world out for, when that dissolves, the thinking just starts to calm down. You just get less of it. So I just have a lot less thinking than I used to. You know, I still think sometimes, of course I do, but I just have a lot less of it. And that isn't because I'm trying to do thinking techniques. It's just because I'm less fascinated by my own thoughts now. I just know how unreliable the thinking mind is. So I just don't buy into it because I know it's not crucial. It's not fundamental. It's not part of me. So why would I be so bought into something that's not fundamental to me? So we've probably just hit the end of time. So listeners, I hope you've found something interesting in that or curious in that. And I'm sure, and I'll share Andrew's details in the show notes, that to a link to his book and his Overthinkers Anonymous community. I'm sure he'd be very happy for you to check out his stuff. Anywhere particularly you would point people to, Andrew, if they want to know more about you?
You can get everything from my website, which is overthinkers.co.uk. Great
name. You can't make it much simpler than that, can you, really? Overthinkers.co.uk. Now, listeners, have a jolly good think about whether you want to go onto his website. And I suggest you procrastinate at least for 5 minutes before doing it. No, not really. So, Andrew, is anything else, final little, anything you want to gift us just for the last 20 seconds that would just put a big bow on it for you?
I think sometimes this conversation can come across as like people just trying to sound clever, but it's kind of the
opposite. Done that very well.
It's like, no, but you know what I mean? It's like, oh, these people talking about some random stuff. It's like, it's way simpler.
Oh.
People think it's like more complicated, but it's way simpler. And that's kind of what because I'm used to thinking, it took me a while to see that, oh my God, this is like way simpler than I imagined.
Yeah. It's a great place to say, because I mean, I say to people, this goes from invisible to subtle to obvious, right? In different parts of it in different moments. And when it goes to obvious, you're just like, oh yeah, the simplicity is just deafening. However, often with people, because we overthink, if you just start with the simplicity, and listeners, if you want that, I've got 3-minute versions that sum everything up. It's too simple for us to hear. The almost like the conceptual mind needs to grab onto something. It's so funny. I think we almost have to massively overcomplicate it to end up with, you know, when they do those brewers have they have loads of pipe and tubing, and a little bit of something drops out at the end, and you're thinking, wow, that's a lot of tubing to get a little bit out. But it's almost like we have to do that in our mind, just go round and round and round and round and round in circles for a little bit of clarity to go pop at the end. But if I gave you the bit at the end to start with, you'd like, might not make any sense.
That's certainly what I did.
Yeah, me too. Anyway, we invite you to join us on this merry-go-round, listeners. And if you want to reach out to to me, obviously, of course, you can, or to Andrew. But Andrew, just leaves me to say thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great chat. We could talk for ages. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been so much fun. Thanks, Piers.
So listeners, as usual, have fun being curious and catch you next time.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast and want to know more, check out our website at qualityofmind.biz. And also, feel free to reach out and leave us a review or a comment. Until next time, have fun being curious.